This is the Floridaville. Get to know the people behind the Florida names you know. I'm your host, Rosanna Catalano. On this episode, we get to know Dr. Alma Kadragic, an entrepreneur, a journalist, a researcher in the United States, Europe, and the Middle East, and the president of Alcat Communications International, a company that bridges the gap between traditional media and the modern complexity of the digital media landscape. We're recording remotely today. I'm in my home in Tallahassee, and Alma is speaking to us from her home office in Coral Gables, Florida. Well, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Your resume is so dynamic, and each position builds on top of the other. So I thought we would start in chronological order for today's interview. So let's start at the beginning, the very beginning. Tell us where you were born and where you grew up.
I'm not going to reveal dates, which a lot of people will understand, but I was actually born in Budapest, and it's not that we were Hungarians or lived there for any amount of time. My parents were from Yugoslavia. This was during the communist period, of course, and they wanted to, especially my father, who was Mr. American Dream, they wanted to get out of Yugoslavia, go west. My mother would have been happy with Europe, but no, my father was America, America. And so we made our way to Geneva, and that's where I got when I was 3 years old, and stayed there another 5 years until we got a visa for the U.S. and were able to get on a ship in Le Havre, France, on that coast, and I think it was about 2 weeks. 2 weeks later, we arrived in New York Harbor and saw the Statue of Liberty, which I didn't, my parents were very excited about. I didn't know, it's kind of interesting, but I didn't know what I knew much later.
What were you like as a child? Did you have any hobbies?
My prime hobby always was reading. I was an incredible bookworm, and it was. My parents were always reading things, and wherever we were, no matter how sort of temporary our place was, because I lived in. I think we totaled this up once, but before we got to New York, I think we had lived in something like 15 or 20 different places, and most of which were not apartments, but rather hotels and things of that sort. So it was. Reading was just something that I took to. I was a shy kid. I was very much into curling up with a book, and I did all those things which kids who really love to read do, like reading with a flashlight under the covers when you're supposed to be snoozing, stuff like that. And that was just part of my life, and that has persisted. I mean, through all of the changes, reading is always the biggest relaxation, and just something which is a major part of my life.
Where did you attend college?
Okay. So once we were done with the wandering around Europe part, we stayed in New York for a long time. And the first apartment actually that my parents found was in Riverdale, which is Northwest Bronx, just under Westchester. And it was, it was an ideal type of situation. I walked, we lived in it's wrong to say a project because it was a commercial building, but it was a bunch of 6-story red brick type of buildings, pretty close to tenements with fire escapes and all of that. And it was up a little hill, and just down the hill was PS 81, which was my first school that I went to, and I came home for lunch and all this kind of stuff. It was terrific. Although, of course, when you're living these things, you don't know, they just are. Later on, you realize, yeah, I was lucky. I never had to be bused anywhere, or had any of these kind of difficulties that people now have. And everybody, all my friends were pretty much also children of immigrants from Europe. And they were all ambitious and reading a lot, and there was no problem with motivating the kids, because the parents would motivate them when they got home if they hadn't gotten the grades that they were expected to get, which was only 100s and A's, or whatever it happened to be. And so it was a very nice childhood. We didn't have much money at all, because my parents were professionals, so for them was not the the route which many immigrants have undergone. But they both had PhDs. My father had one from Yugoslavia. My mother, the first thing she did when we arrived here was to study at Columbia and in international law and relations, and that's what she got her PhD exactly just before we became citizens. So barely 5 years after we had arrived.
So, what did you major in college?
Oh, English. I went to Bronx Science, which anybody who's had a sort of New York education will know about. I mean, it was a special high school. You had to do very well in your on the English side and on the math side. I got in because of the English side. Math was always a little dubious for me, and I didn't like it. And English was just rolling down a hill. I mean, it was the easiest thing for me. I could have majored in anything which involved a lot of reading, like history or poli-sci or psych or something like that. But what I loved always was reading novels, and here you were supposed to do that. It was great.
So I know that you have a master's degree, and obviously you have your PhD. What made you decide to attend graduate school?
It was really, you have to understand that all of my higher education, I lived at home. So we were a tiny family of 3 people. I was the center, but my parents were very busy carving out careers and so on. So I grew up with kind of knowing all about that and hearing about that. But I really had no idea what I was going to do. I pretty soon became a good writer in whatever context it was, and which is straight from my mother, because I got that from her. But the only thing which at that time seemed possible was to be teaching English in college and going on and doing research and writing books and scholarly books and and doing that kind of thing. And it just, the more I taught as a graduate student, the less I liked it, because the people I were teaching, they were all very nice, and they were quite nice to me, and I was nice to them. But there were very few. It was seldom to see a student who really loved literature. And what I wanted to be teaching was essentially people like me or some of my friends. And you just don't get that in a big urban university. So I was pretty quickly not liking it. And then the other thing, which I have to say, that I never took a journalism course. I never took a PR course. However, City College had not one, but 2 at that time, student newspapers, which came out at least once a week or often twice a week, and so on. And the one which I became associated with was called The Campus. It was founded in 1907, so it had a long tradition. And then sitting in New York, a lot of the people who had graduated and had been editors and writers for The Campus were still around. And usually on Friday afternoons, kind of 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock, we would sit in our extremely small and grungy office with, I can see the couch in front of me. I mean, it was a couch that you wouldn't ever want to have anywhere that you lived, but it was great. We flopped around and on the floor, of course, and so on. And then one of our people who was working by that point at the Times or the Herald Tribune was still around. I mean, there are many more newspapers, would come and would take the paper sort of and look at it and say, okay, let's look at the front page. Okay, this headline, who wrote this headline? And I wrote it. Said, well, it doesn't really make sense, and it doesn't match the beginning of the story, which I hadn't written. It was somebody else, but you're supposed to do a headline that made sense, and so on. So in other words, we had this extensive critique from people who were a few years ahead of us and who had gone through the process and all the rest of that. So the longer I was there, the more time I put into The Campus, and I became, I think my first editorship was copy editor, then I was features editor, and then I was up to become editor. However, each one was for 1 semester, and I would have had to wait until the final semester of my senior year to become editor, whereas the person who was selected for the first semester of the senior year was actually a year behind me, and a guy. of whom there weren't too many around at that time, I mean, there weren't too many women around at that time, as you can imagine. And I just didn't like that whole thing. So I said, okay, fine, I'm getting out of this. And I was invited to do English honors, which required a thesis. So of course I did that. And so I graduated, and okay, I'm going to be teaching, but what I really loved was this journalism, which I had been doing, on a very like baseball Class D league maybe, or something like that. But I loved that. So as I started going through graduate school, and you asked me why I went to graduate school, it was because they said, here, have an assistantship, go to graduate school. Maybe you should be working on a PhD, and not having, anything specific. And this was way before, I think, if I had been several years later, probably 20 years later, I would have gone into the military, because I think that would have appealed to me an awful lot. I probably wouldn't have liked the basic training or any of that stuff, but I liked the concept of it, and I was always, like most immigrants, I mean, terribly patriotic from at home and from on my own behalf, and so I just kept sort of taking the path of least resistance. But then a very good thing happened, and several times, you mentioned how things kind of fit. Well, they fit in retrospect. At the time they were happening, you didn't understand. So by the time that I was almost finished with the PhD, I just had to knock off the dissertation. I was teaching full-time at the city university, but knowing that I couldn't get a real full-time job, which would be on a tenure track or anything like that, because they believed in sending their graduate students to other schools. And I was in New York. I had no particular desire to go anyplace else. And I was very much of a baby still, and still living at home and all of that. And so the good thing that happened was that I lost my job, because there were budget cuts in the city, as always happens from time to time. And of course, who can they get rid of? They can get rid of junior faculty that doesn't have tenure, and so on. So all of a sudden, I was out of a job. What am I going to do? And then I started looking around, and had various adventures in potential jobs, none of which involved teaching, because I knew I wasn't crazy about teaching as it was then constituted. And so one of my colleagues in graduate school was married to a guy who worked for the New York Times, and through someone that they introduced me to a lot of people at NBC, which is where he went after the Times. But it's sort of, I was too educated to be a bright beginner, but on the other hand, I didn't have any really broadcasting experience, which they kind of like you to have. And so they didn't know what to do with me. So kind of as an afterthought, I was sent to see one of his colleagues from Columbia Journalism School, who was at ABC. And this was really the only person I ever met in my ABC career who thought that the fact that I had a PhD didn't mean I was a total idiot. I might know something, because it's very, I'm sure it hasn't changed that much. It's very craft oriented. Do you know how to do this? And have you done it? And so on. And
that's right.
Afterwards, once I really was good at it, seeing people, there are people who would come in with the kind of non-experience that I had and would catch on, and others who just not catch on. And it had nothing to do with how smart you were, or how good your grades had been, or SATs, or any of that sort of stuff. It was really just how you got it, whatever it was that you were supposed to get, how you got it. So anyway, after a year of sort of kind of knocking around, where my parents really helped me, because as these things happen, I had bought a new car just before I got fired, when I thought that, okay, I have this, I'm getting X amount of money, I have this new car. I had moved into my second own apartment, which was in Riverdale, which was reasonably not cheap, and then all of a sudden, I have no money coming in. So my parents gave me the money, which I then later paid back. But I mean, there was no question. And my father was especially always very strong with this, as, of course, don't worry about it, we'll take care of it. So it took a year before I met the guy at ABC who was willing to give me a chance. I never knew that in certain areas they hire so-called summer replacements who can work there for, I think, because that's a Writers Guild union contract, they could work for about 5 months and then had to be either made permanent or kicked out. And I just I got the job, and I hung on, and I hung on really through just gumption, and because I was very lucky, there was one woman in this group of 10 people who immediately took me under her wing, and that was one of these kind of pay it forward things where I felt afterwards that I always tried to do that because she had been so friendly and helpful to me. And then the other thing was that I think on the second day that I was there, this was the least glamorous area of ABC News, which a lot of people not in the business don't even know about. But it was the affiliates feed. So every evening at 5 o'clock, they would send through a half hour of independent spots, which a station in Tallahassee or wherever that was an affiliate of theirs could record, and then they could use it because we sent a script through also, so one of their people could voice the thing and so on. So we covered essentially national stories, which a local station wouldn't have access to normally, covered national sports, and of course international stuff and like that. So on the second day that I was there, the guy who was the so-called editor said, I have this baseball story here. Who wants to do that? I said, oh, I'll do it. And I could see on his face that he was sure that this chick had no idea what she was talking about. But he was out of luck because I was a baseball fan from almost, the first moment I started third grade in Riverdale.
So did you end up writing sports for ABC?
I mean, with those guys, I wrote sports. I never worked for ABC Sports. I was always in ABC News. But yes, I mean, I covered several World Series and a football, a Super Bowl, which was it was at the Rose Bowl, I remember, which they're not using for that so much anymore. But at that time it was, and that was for Good Morning America. Because at that time the Rams had a woman owner, so this was grist for Good Morning America, and so we covered the game and sat in the whatever they call it, and I call it the dugout because of baseball, and then we went up to the super duper boxes up on top, where we were brought because this owner knew Ethel Kennedy very well. And so we came into this box, and there's Ethel Kennedy, and who's very unbelievably sweet, even to the point of saying to me, I mean, I was a child at that time, saying to me, oh dear, would you like to sit down? I said, no, I'm fine. We're working here and stuff like that. But anyway, there were all kinds of great adventures with sports, and which I did know. But baseball was always the first.
So you worked at ABC for longer than a decade.
16 years.
Yeah. What prompted you to leave and become an entrepreneur? Because if I've got the dates right, you left ABC and then you became an entrepreneur. Is that right?
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of the other way around. But at some point, when you work for a big corporation of any type, you kind of, after a while, you sort of know how things go. You initially, or I certainly had ambitions at the beginning. Okay, I'm gonna get to the top, which for me meant to be executive producer of the World News Tonight at that time with Peter Jennings and others. I mean, ultimately with just him, and things of that sort. But then I got sidetracked is wrong, but I was sent overseas, and overseas is really what I always wanted to do, especially Eastern Europe. I mean, because of my parents, I spoke Serbo-Croatian, which doesn't exist anymore, by the way. Now there's a language called Serbian and another called Croatian and Bosnian, and Slovenian was always a little bit different, but they can understand basic Serbo-Croatian. But everybody calls it what their country is, whereas before, it was just a big jumble, and everybody spoke. So when I go there, I always like to say that I'm the last living person speaking Serbo-Croatian. But I had that background, and then that enabled me when. So to get back to ABC, so in 1982, about 3 years after I thought these guys are never going to send me overseas, because things in corporations always happen more slowly than you would like, and that is in some cases logical. And all of a sudden, I'm offered to go to London because the producer of the news on Good Morning America said, where can I have new news in the morning? Well, I can only have it from overseas. I mean, once in a while there's some sort of dramatic fire or hurricane or God knows what happening in the U.S. But generally speaking, that's people's snoozing time. So new news is going to be out there in Asia and in Europe. And so I was sent to London. Which, I had been to London a few times before that, but I was extremely happy about that, to essentially coordinate all of the material that for Good Morning America that would come in, that could be set up for that day's programs. And with the time difference of 6 to 9 hours, if you were out on the West Coast, not even counting Hawaii and Alaska, which is worse, you could get a lot of stuff done and updated and so on. So I'm sent to London, and that was great, except that the executive producer for whom I worked, maybe about 4 or 5 months after I was in London, he's gone and replaced by someone who I absolutely couldn't stand. And I'm not going to name any names because this person is still around, not in networks, thank God, but I thought he was just awful. He was a yeller and a screamer, and that's something which I never tolerated. And there was one incident where I was yelled at on a so-called PL private line, from New York through Washington, Atlanta, LA, all the local bureaus, and Paris and London, whatever, to Warsaw, where we were covering one of the visits of Pope John Paul II to Poland, and that was a very big story at the time, and all the rest of it. And so I get yelled at because we missed a story because a courier didn't make it. This is the fascinating thing, by the way, and this ties into what I started doing later, because in TV, it's, especially at that time, it's not enough to have the material. You have to be able to get the material to somewhere, because I wasn't working for Polish TV or European TV or anything like that. It had to get to New York, essentially, to be disseminated around the country, and then to their clients in other parts of the world. And when you're covering a story like that, you plant motorcycle couriers in different places, and if somebody misses, camera crew whizzes by, they throw out. This was still the age of cassettes, not of everything being recorded on discs. So they throw out a few cassettes to the courier, who's got to be there, and if he's not there, they can chew those cassettes because they have to go on to their next place where they're covering the next tour of the Pope. So it was something which simply didn't work and should have. But not having the material on the air when the enemy at that time was only CBS and NBC, all had the story, and we didn't have it. So it was terrible, and I get yelled at and so on. But just to give you an idea, when I got back to London and then got the guy on the phone, because you couldn't have, it was a song and a dance to get someone in New York on the phone from Poland. You had to book the call and all kinds of stuff like that. It took time. So finally, when I get to a phone that I can use, and I say to him, how could you do that? Well, he had forgotten it totally, because for him it was just one of 2,000.
It was just an ordinary day to yell and scream. And
I thought it was just awful, and I looked for a way out. And then actually, while I was in Poland on that trip, I learned that the bureau chief, who had been sent there from Washington, was going to go back. And so when I came back to London, I asked the right people, hey, has that job been assigned yet, or is it still available? And then I learned it was still available, and a couple of months later I got the job. So I had been in Poland in July with the Pope, and then at the beginning of October went there to take on the job, which very quickly became bureau chief, because the correspondent who had the title was being moved to someplace else, and like that. So it was a very interesting time, because obviously from 83 until 90 we covered that incredible decline of communism, which in retrospect, again, like everything else, you can see perfectly. But at the time, how is this ever going to end? It makes no sense. It's ridiculous, but they have all the weapons, they have all the military police, they have everything. And of course, there's the Soviet Union, the big guys in Moscow sitting, and there are Soviet troops within Poland, so it was not clear at all how this was going to happen. That was 83. 85 is when Gorbachev came in Moscow, and he wasn't Gorbachev for several more years. It took a few more years to kind of see how that would work out, and for him to realize that he really didn't have the juice, and all he could do was create a bloodbath, but it wouldn't help the real problem, which is just the total lack of ideas, really collapse of the Communist Party in Poland, and and each country was different, but essentially throughout the whole so-called Warsaw Pact, and ultimately 2 years later it went down in Moscow itself. I mean, in the heart of it.
So what prompted you, once you were bureau chief and you were there for a bit, what prompted you to then leave and start your own venture?
Well, yes, and I didn't. I gave you a lot of history, but I didn't answer that question. When when you're doing something, and although it's hard to imagine times which would be more interesting for a journalist, especially somebody with my background, because I had an extra interest in Eastern Europe because of my parents. I mean, my father was constantly talking and reading and keeping up to the extent possible on this side of the world with what was going on there. And he predicted the dissolution of Yugoslavia almost from the beginning. The only thing could have kept it together would be if they had economic success, but they didn't. And I would say that they couldn't, given the system that they were sort of stuck with. And eventually all the true believers ceased to believe, and all the rest of that. But again, going back to working for a very large company with very large, the money is good and the benefits are good and all sorts of stuff is good, but you also, if you're the kind of person as I am, you're not happy with leaving things alone, you want to improve things all the time, you want to change, you see someplace where, why are we doing this? Why couldn't we do that? And so on. Well, you'll get through with some of that, but a lot of it, we'll just say, oh, we can't do that now, or yeah, down girl, just cover the news and don't worry about it. So I started thinking increasingly, and this would be sort of in the second half of the 80s, as I'm covering these stories in Poland and Hungary and Czechoslovakia at that time, East Germany at that time, and Yugoslavia also to a small extent. I'm thinking about, gee, it would be really nice to be my own boss, and so on. Now, mind you, my parents are professionals. They never had a company. Their minds didn't work in that way. However, my mother's brother went to, a year before we went to the US, he and his wife and my cousin Danielle went to Australia. And he had very little education, but he was a brilliant businessman. And he started a company, construction company, essentially. He became very rich, and he's gone now too, but his son, who is the real Australian in the group, he was born there, took it over and is now approaching retirement himself and made a success of it. They have incredible amounts of money. But put it to you another way, half of my relatives are in Australia, the other half from my father's side are in Bosnia. And as I was kind of, doing a will, and so who's going to get what? Well, I can't give anything to the Australians. I mean, it's ridiculous, that they can buy me 6.5 times or more. But whatever I have, whatever remains, will go to the Bosnians, because that's a completely different story. So anyway, there was the example in the family, in the more distant family, of somebody who had tremendous luck as an entrepreneur, and I liked him very much. He came to see us numerous times here. We went, my mother and I, separately and together went to Australia to stay with them. So that was kind of something, which kept it in my mind, just the way as at City College when we were at the campus, those colleagues, former colleagues, who had now made good in major papers, they were sort of opening up a sense of possibility for me. So what happened was then I think it was maybe 87 or something, that ABC made us sign contracts, and I had an agent then for the first and only time in my life who negotiated a really good contract. But one of the things was that I can't start any companies. So I asked my parents if they would start up a company, which they did, which was called Alcat. I mean, the same name, which is my mother's invention, by the way, because my father was Al, she was Catherine. And when Alma would get into it, that would fit anyway, and so on. And in fact, when she registered it while I was away in Europe, and when I came back and said it's Alcat, and I was kind of, I didn't like that particularly, but equally, it really doesn't matter. I mean, it's not, we're not talking Campbell Soup or Ford or something. It's going to depend on what I can do with it, and the name doesn't matter that much. I know this is marketing people, which I am one of too, would be upset about that. But realistically, that's for a small company, that's kind of how that works. So anyway, I think it was in '88 that the company was started, and it was just sitting there, registered in New York. It didn't do anything. And then when I left ABC, I left because A, I wanted to become an entrepreneur. B, they were closing the Warsaw bureau. And this was no threat to my job with ABC, because I was still essentially registered as working, on their books as working in London. So I could have continued working in London for a number of years until maybe, in recent times that would have gone away. But it certainly, I wasn't in danger of losing my job, but I was in danger of repetition. And I don't like repetition. I like change. And going back to London, rather than sort of having a territory to cover where I knew a lot of people, had a lot of contacts, was able to get in on a lot of stories that not everybody could get. In London, I would be what we called a fireman, going to, okay, there's something there, go there, see what you can do, and then, okay, come back, maybe you can do something there, and like that. And it's difficult to, you're an expert in creating something out of nothing or nearly nothing. I learned how to do that too, but it didn't appeal to me as a way to continue. And so let's do something different. So I'm going to start a company. Well, what's it going to do? Well, my first thought was it's going to be a production company and do documentaries. Except that around that same time, I got several documentary producers in the US who are doing great work, but independents, were calling me up and kind of saying, hey, I'm doing blah, blah. How can I get this to ABC and so on, which kind of opened my eyes and said, okay, this is not that easy. And I don't have contacts on that end of it. I have news contacts, but I was always working in daily news, short form, etc. And this is a completely different thing. Maybe it's not the best way to start. Okay, so I'm going to have a company, and I'm going to call it consulting, because who knows what that is. And the idea I had was that in 1990, the second half, a lot of companies which had not been in Poland ever, or they had maybe until World War II, were now looking at it again because new market, etc. And so what happened was that I thought I would be helping American companies get into the market, which I did in a couple of cases, but that wasn't the main work. Around that same time, a group of Americans, or I should really say Polish Americans, who had experienced here but had gone back to Poland, said, we've got to have an American Chamber of Commerce here. In communist countries, you do not have American Chambers of Commerce. It's not, not part of the model. But in most normal markets, you do. And so I went to an organizing meeting where I talked quite a lot. And at the end of that, a guy came up to me and he said, hi, I'm from American Express, and starting up here and so on. We need a news conference and we need a party at the Royal Castle. I said, can you do that? And whenever my answer, whenever anybody asks me anything, is yes, of course. And then I either know it slightly, I know who I can get to help me. I'll figure it out, is the bottom line. And it's a challenge. And it helps also because it has to be admitted that if I had tried to do the same thing in New York or in Miami, in any larger city in the U.S., I mean, I would have been completely out of my league. But there, I was an American who spoke Polish, who had a long existence with ABC News. I was flavor of the month for quite a while there, and so we were getting clients. Nobody was too cool on what PR actually was and what they could do. Questions like a guy who was a shoe distributor said, "Well, if I hire you, how many shoes will I sell?" And so there was a lot of explaining that one had to do, and
Right.
things like that. But my first client was American Express. My second was Levi Strauss. My third was Citibank, and it went like that through Compaq, and then later on Dell, Sun Microsystems, if you remember them, General Motors, many other companies of that ilk. Westinghouse, which used to be a big shot in nuclear plants, which they were trying to do in I think they did eventually in Hungary, and so on. All kinds of stuff like that. So it was very interesting, and it was
So
again like
sorry.
ABC. It was learning it as I went along.
So you built up this company with an incredible book of business, but then you went to teach. And I know you went to teach in Abu Dhabi and Dubai for a bit.
Okay,
What
well,
did
the first was in Poland, and that's when I first taught PR because I was getting a lot of interns who had essentially master's degrees, because in Europe, not in the UK, but in continental Europe, when they finish their college, they've done 5 years, so they have what's recognized here too as the equivalent of a master's and so on. So these kids who are all very smart, well educated, no problem with reading or any of that sort of stuff, highly literate, et cetera, many of them in English as well as in Polish, would come in and then, talk about, we always had a kind of a small daily meeting, and then we would have a meeting at the end of the week, and, all this sort of stuff, which is a combination of my journalism experiences and ABC experiences. And they would be, we didn't learn anything like this. I mean, they didn't learn how to do a news conference. They learned about the philosophy of crowds and all sorts of things of that sort. What I found was that, and this is kind of my theory of life in general, that it's great to get out in the field first, and then when you read the literature, then you understand it. Then you can see parallels, you can understand it. If you do it the other way, which is still what we're doing here for the most part, and what they're doing in Europe even more, is that you first have all the books, and then you have to somehow, despite what you've seen in the books, you have to be effective. And for example, effective, and for me, the task was how to talk to these kids who were essentially much more like I was when I was their age, kind of sort of tending to be shy, comfortable with their buddies, but not, with a stranger. And we would do a lot of events for clients. And so I would, we'd come into one of these beautiful palaces or event spaces, of which there are more and more as time went on, and I would see, my guys, the 3 or 4 of them who were working on that thing, they would be huddled in a corner chit-chatting, enjoying themselves totally, and so on. Meanwhile, there would be like an exposition, or there would be tables, there would be people coming in who didn't know other people, and guys, we can't do this. Consider yourself that you're a host. And you can go up to anybody and say, "Hi, I'm blah blah, and I work with Alcat Communications. Can I help you? Do you know anybody here, or should I introduce you to some people?" All this kind of stuff. And Poland, Eastern Europe in general, has a much stronger, although okay, you have an Italian background, so you understand perfectly. And Hispanics, as I see down here in Florida, have this also, but not all Europeans have strong hospitality traditions. But there, I could get them with that. I could say, it's really your event, so you have to welcome people, you have to talk to them, and so on. And if we have an expo table here and we have some brochures or some little trinkets or whatever, you can't be turned away from that table and chatting with your colleague back here, and you've got to be kind of looking at people and trying to catch their eye as they come by, and can I tell you about this, blah blah blah, and so on. Stuff which is, these kids, maybe it's changing by now, and I don't know, but they didn't have the sort of show and tell experience that most American kids have, and they didn't have the thing about how you present yourself, and it's important to look at people and all of these sorts of things, which I mean, not every kid is perfect at this, but they've at least heard about it. But there, the problem was really just to get these, to sort of Americanize them a little bit without losing the advantages they had in being educated and sort of nicely dressed young ladies and gentlemen type of thing, which was expected there very much. In those kinds of situations. So it was very exciting. However, and you're going to ask me what made me leave, there was only one problem with all of this. I mean, I always came back to the US a lot, definitely for Christmas in Poland. I mean, life stops around December 15, 17, something like that. It doesn't really start up again until sort of at least January 10th or something in that line. And of course, it was the staff loved being given that time off and all the rest of it. So, and I loved being able to go back to New York and hang out with my parents and friends and all the rest of that. But at a certain point, I kind of really, I'm doing well here, but I got to the point where, in order for what we say now, scale, we didn't use that term at that time, but in order to scale that business, I would have to commit to it more fully. And I frankly didn't feel like it. I had looked with non-success for somebody local who could be my partner. And what happened, which happens in a lot of emerging markets, is that whoever was like that, their idea was to have their own company, and a couple of the people who worked for me actually started their companies, and the ones who didn't, but they went to bigger companies and the local outlets of some of the international companies and things of that sort. So I never solved that problem. Again, I could have solved it if I had put more time in there. But I was getting to the point where, okay, I want to spend more time in the U.S. and less here, and how can we do this cleanly? And then the other thing was that I was basically, for several years, I was basically homeless. Now, in Warsaw, I had a nice place to a kind of small, as they call it, a villa, which had 3 stories, and ground floor, second floor, or they call it the first floor, and then the top floor. Top floor had a bedroom and bathroom, and most importantly, a very large closet. And that was where I lived. That was my home. But the second floor had my office, which was really the living room, of the house, and had I think another room there as well. It's quite spacious. And then on the ground floor was what I turned into the newsroom kind of sort of thing. And I didn't want people to be tucked away in their offices because, they needed more working together. First of all, we didn't have the space for it, but also because of my newsroom training and earlier with the college paper, I just believed in the effectiveness of having people be together, so everybody would know what was going on, and nobody would be able to say, in answer to a phone call, well, I don't know about that. That's my colleague, but she's not here now, so just leave a message, something like that. I wanted everybody to be very much involved in everything.
Alma, I'm going to stop you right there. I want to take a quick commercial break. And when we come back, I want to talk about a little bit more about your time overseas, your return to the United States, and tell us a little bit more.
Yeah.
And tell us a little bit more about Nperspective. So Let's take a quick commercial break.
This episode of The Floridaville is brought to you by Rocket Ship Consultants. Let us help you launch your career, your business, your podcast, or your live stream. Follow us on Facebook and on Instagram, and visit our website at www.rocketshipconsultants.com.
Welcome back. My guest today is Dr. Alma Kadragic, the president of Alcat Communications International in Miami, Florida. Before the break, we discussed a bit about how you built up your business overseas. We talked about how you had returned to teaching overseas. At some point, you left being overseas and returned to the United States. Can you tell us more about your company, Alcat Communications?
Sure. Well, it was, again, when you're in an emerging market, everybody does everything. So whereas, here, certainly in Tallahassee, you might have a PR agency and you're very strong on digital, but then you need some advertising for one of your clients, and you go to a friendly other company with whom you share business sometimes and send your client to that, and so on. In the early stages, that just doesn't happen because you have a client, you want to hug them to your bosom and never let them go, and figure out everything that's needed for them. So that's a very early stage. Poland is no longer like that. I should mention that well, two things very briefly. One was that just as there was no American Chamber of Commerce, there was no PR association. And I knew from my experience in the world that there should be a PR association and to build a business. And that was a bit of a sales job on my part. I mean, I had a Polish colleague who had his own firm, and he's been a buddy all these years, and I could always get him to do things. The only thing I couldn't get him to do was to become president of that association, which initially I did. So I was the first president for, I think, about 4 years of the association, until I said, okay, enough of this. One of you guys has to do it. It shouldn't be an outsider. And that was also part of the time that I was drawing back. The other thing, very briefly, when these interns who worked with me, who were all very smart, when I started to see what they knew and they didn't know anything about PR as it's generally taught around here, and certainly not as it's operated. And so I went to the guy who was the dean of the PR school at the University of Warsaw, and kind of said to him, look, you're teaching them stuff which is interesting, but it doesn't really help them in their day-to-day work at all. Well, what do you want to do? I said, well, I could, and again, I volunteered my colleague Piotr. I said, Piotr and I could do classes on Saturdays and Sundays, which would be practical, which would be really, how to do various things. And so he bought that enthusiastically. I think I didn't even take any salary for that, or maybe I did, but I gave it to the association. I don't remember. Anyway, it was negligible in our terms. And so we started that. And I know that when I left, of course, I didn't do that anymore, but I know that he continued doing it. And it's a very sort of valuable thing that they're doing. And other schools have also begun to be more useful in terms of news you can use, for operating in PR. But anyway, to get back to the whole thing. So I was doing well. But in order to do better, in order to really grow the company, I needed to spend more time there. And I just didn't feel like that. My main stuff, which had gone from London to a storage place on Long Island, was, I hadn't seen it for about 6 years. And I said, I really need someplace in the US where I can unroll my stuff and stay there when I'm there, and eventually move in full time. So my first idea was to live around Lincoln Center, which is the area that I like best in New York, and that's where ABC News was, and so on and so forth. Except that when I started looking around in good buildings, a studio apartment cost $300,000. And that seemed to me ridiculous, and that didn't take care of the car, which would need a garage space, which would be, $800 or
I was
something.
about to say that's a whole other mortgage payment. Parking
Exactly.
in New York.
We're talking now in '96, so all of that is more. And rents have gone down now a little bit with COVID, but there's still a lot. And on the other hand, I remembered that I had been to a couple of conferences in the Orlando area. I had never been to Disney World or any of those attractions. I mean, not having kiddies or being a kid by the time all of that was accessible to me. I just hadn't been there, but I thought, hey, maybe, why don't I nip down there and see what's available? And so I called up Coldwell Banker, just, an 800 number, stayed at that very lovely Marriott there in the Disney area, and was taken around for 2 days by what proved to be a wonderful agent. And on the second day, we went to Winter Park, because I said something about how, there's no shade here. I was thinking already of bringing my parents down and the dog, and, what's the dog going to do in this killer sun, and so on. And she takes me to a house in it was actually a townhouse attached on one side, with a little swimming pool. Now for a New Yorker, swimming pool was just, and an orange
lot.
tree,
Yeah,
an orange tree, 3 bedrooms, 3 baths. And a little kind of garden in the back, and a sago palm, or actually 2 sago palms,
so
whatever. And the whole damn thing cost I'm forgetting now. It was 240,000. And I half-heartedly negotiated for 5,000 less, and the people said no. I said, it's ridiculous. I'll take it, of course. And so at the beginning of really the end of '96, I moved down during that holiday break, and moved in. And then in March, I had my parents and Jingles the dog come down, and they loved it. And they came down again in the summer, because we didn't know. We had heard horror stories about what the summer would be like, except that this was the first time for all of us living in central air. And of course, it was much cooler than just having a few window units, which was the case in their house in New York. So anyway,
I'm always happy to hear about people that become Floridians by choice, because I think many Floridians actually get here by choice, and they weren't necessarily born here. We're a little bit running out of time, so I wanted to squeeze in here and have you tell me a little bit about your position. I know you're the Director of Business Development in South Florida for Nperspective, and I'm hoping you can share with the audience what that company does.
Sure. Well, it's a very interesting company. It's called, the full name is Nperspectives CFO and Strategic Services. And what they do is they provide part-time, highly experienced, not kids. The average, the sort of going age there starts around 50 in almost 100% of the cases. People who have had a lot of big league corporate experience, but are now living down here, want to stay down here, like the idea of working with smaller individual clients. Again, the business of, in a big corporation, you can't get your point across too many times. And working with a smaller client, you can you see what their problem is. You make some suggestions. You say, hey, just to give you some typical examples, you have 3 lines of business. Do you know which of these are actually profitable? Well, I don't really know. And it turns out that one line of business is losing money. So the more orders they get, the more they lose. So it's just the opposite of things are supposed to work. And then one of them is kind of mainly holding even, and one of them is really doing very well, and obviously asked to be expanded and all the rest of that. Well, it's a little bit like you go to a specialist. You have some sort of condition, and the specialist looks at you and takes a few films or whatever, and says, okay, here's your problem. And that's really the basis of what we do. And we do it so well that clients who start with us who are a little bit, well, let's see if this is going to really help, and kind of like that, very quickly come to say, yeah, I see what you mean. I see that this can work. It's really interesting knowing practically to the day how much money we have, what our cash position is, et cetera, which is, it's just amazing to me how people have made millions of dollars without really totally knowing what they're doing. And here's the good thing about a crisis. When you have a crisis, you're forced to kind of look at things, more with a magnifying glass or microscope, whatever you want, to sort of see, okay, well, we just lost a couple of our clients, and what do we have here? What can we do? And it makes us more valuable to the clients. It also makes people who have not been using a CFO. A lot of entrepreneurs don't. They're kind of doing it themselves. I was one of those too. I never had a CFO. And when I see now what I could have kept of the money we made, which I didn't, it's just, it was part of the learning. But money was never sort of my primary thing. I just wanted to have enough to not worry about it. But it wasn't, I didn't have the right attitude for a business person, like my uncle certainly did, and understood all of that. So Nperspective comes in and works on a basis of, okay, here's a project, you need something done, or you have maybe a bookkeeper or a family member who's kind of doing these things, who sort of knows it, but maybe is not as well versed as could be, and certainly may not be able to help you scale, which you probably are now ready to do. We come into all those kinds of situations and help. We're too small a company. We have about 20 CFOs scattered around South Florida, Central Florida, where the firm began, and Tampa. We're the babies here in South Florida. Tampa was the second one started, but it's a very virtual firm. We have office space we can use in all of our locations, but essentially people work out of their home offices or at the clients, depending, of which there's less now because of the situation. But it's up to what the client wants. Wherever the client wants the CFOs to be, that's where they'll be.
Well, that sounds like an amazing business. So we like to end our show with a little fun by asking all of our guests the same 7 questions. What would people be surprised to know about you?
Well, maybe sort of how much I read, because I belong to a book club, and I have several friends to read, but I read much more than any of them. And I don't talk about it too much. I mean, some books you don't particularly want to talk about. Quite a bit of what I read is not heavy duty, is detective stories and mysteries and stuff like that. So and I read a lot of nonfiction as well, history and European history, but also all kinds of different things. I spent almost 8 years in the Gulf. And so this was after Poland and after buying the place in Orlando. So I became interested in that, which I had never been before. So I've read a huge book on the Arabs, the 3,000 years of history, which is absolutely fascinating. There's no limit to what you can read. The only limit for me is if I start reading something and it's badly written. I write well enough myself so that I can tell the difference between, somebody who's writing with gusto and enjoyment, and you can do, heavy duty information and still do it well, and avoid repetition and be lively and all the rest of that. But a lot of people don't write that way. And if I start something of that sort, unless I'm reading it for the book club or there's some other pressing reason, I know it's an important book and I should at least skim it, I'll just dump it and not worry about it longer.
When you have guests in town, where is your favorite place to take them?
Well, I love restaurants. So wherever, I have in various favorites, but now that we're with this virus business, one of in Coral Gables, one of the very, very, very best terraces is Bashur, which is actually part of your heritage, started by a guy whose grandparents were from Lebanon, but they went to Puerto Rico. And his parents then grew up, or father, I think, grew up there, and mother was from a fellow country in the area. And so the guy speaks Arabic, Arabic, Spanish, of course, French, where he trained for his chefing, and naturally English. And it's a fabulous place for sweets, which are not particularly my thing, but all of their food is fabulous. And they have, it's not like just umbrellas or an awning or anything like that. The restaurant is it's a little complex of two buildings. One is done by Codina Ventures, who's a major developer around here in Miami. So one part is an office building, which is, I think, 6 stories, something like that, and then a courtyard. And on the other side of the courtyard is the residential building, which is condos and I think also some rentals. And those two are linked by a 20-foot high, masonry kind of join between those two buildings. So you have a fantastic deck to be on, where you could have, I haven't tested this yet, but if there were a hurricane, you could be under that and you wouldn't get wet. I mean, I've certainly been there when it's been raining like crazy and you just don't get wet because of it. So that's my current favorite place. I always take people to the Biltmore, where you have, first of all, you have eating casually by the pool, and then you have the Fontana restaurant, which is around a fountain, as you might suspect, and has great food. I haven't been to the Palm, which is their really super duper, super expensive Frenchy type restaurant, because I feel it's not essential, but I like to go there because they're outdoors. And then one of my all-time favorites always is Seasons 52, which we have a nice version down here on Miracle Mile. But they have a few umbrellas, and if it's raining, you don't want to be there. And I haven't yet graduated to going to restaurants inside. I don't want to do that yet for a while.
So what is the name of a book you recently read that you could not put down, or the name of a show you enjoyed binge watching?
Oh, I'm a great binger, and I love, both on Prime and on Netflix, you have lots of foreign programs. And I like them, whether there's several good series in Polish and occasionally in Russian. And of course, the Scandinavians have all sorts of detective stories and whatever. I don't like ghosts, so I stay away from anything which is spooky. And I don't like science fiction. I like to read science fiction, but not to see it so much, because it's always, except for the whole Star Wars thing that I love. And I love Harry Potter. But generally speaking, so you asked me a book. There's a book which came out very recently called The Daughters of Yalta. The Yalta Conference, was one of the conferences that happened during World War II between Stalin and FDR and Churchill. And they were held, Yalta was, in the Crimea, and Stalin didn't want to travel outside of the boundaries of the then Soviet Union, so it was there. The interesting thing is that each of these guys, FDR, Churchill, and Averell Harriman, who was the U.S. ambassador to Moscow at the time, brought to that conference their daughters, not their wives or girlfriends or whatever. Those people stayed home, wherever that was, but they brought their daughters, who were essentially their assistants, except that they couldn't, because this is 1944 and women didn't attend really important things, but they were responsible for setting up the comfort as much as it could be assured of these people, and they were on the edges of what was actually happening. So it's extremely interesting, because one of them, Anna Harriman, spoke Russian, so she knew it, but the other two did not. And they were doing their best in this very strange place. World War II was still going on. The Soviet Union was quite devastated by it, and they got an old palace to use for the headquarters of these guys. But they didn't have. It's kind of like us. They didn't have things like toilet paper. They didn't have just the very ordinary things which we in the West have always, until recently, taken totally for granted. And these women had to sort of set all of that up and do it. And it's written by a young woman, a scholar from Columbia, I think is where she got her Ph.D. And she writes very well. So she makes this whole thing which is completely nonfiction. Did extensive research on among the papers of these women and of their fathers and all concerned people, and it kind of gives you an incredible idea of what's behind one of these sorts of international conferences where huge decisions are made. By the way, that decision at Yalta was what led to 40 years of communism in Eastern Europe, because the Stalin hung tough and Roosevelt gave in to him. Churchill was against it, but couldn't do anything. He didn't have the muscle. So it's very, very interesting.
It sounds like an interesting book. Among your close family and friends, what are you best known for?
Probably for some of the things you pointed out, for the changes all the time, for the non-repetition, for being interested in intellectual things, in having lots of opinions, which I'm not reluctant to express. Although politics, for example, I mean, and this has nothing to do with the current situation. Going back to college. I'm used to not babbling about politics because I was usually on the wrong side, quotes wrong side, and the knowledge I had from at home, and then my experience overseas, just made me feel that I knew things that other people didn't know, and a little bit like, okay, if you don't like literature, I'm not going to really tell you why you should like it, and it's the same way with you need some common ground, and if you can't find too much common ground, like the people who say, oh, look at Cuba, they have such wonderful health care. Well, that's only if you don't know any Cubans who've experienced that health care, which they're primarily anyway exporting so that they can earn some hard currency rather than benefiting their local citizens. But anyway, so it's just something that I tend not to do.
So you're known for having your opinions as well as always being on a new adventure. If you have a nickname, who gave it to you? You don't have to tell us the nickname, but do you have one? Did someone give you a nickname?
No, back in college, a friend who's still in New York and who I don't see very often. I mean, we went sort of way apart, but for some reason, and this is stupid, for some reason, Alma, she kind of made into Elmer. And I don't know if they're even still around, there was the cartoon character Elmer Fudd. So, she called me Fuddy sometimes and whatever. But it wasn't a nickname that sort of stuck. I don't think it's nice having a very short name of only 4 letters, because there's not too much you can do with that. And on the other hand, it's a name for which I have to thank, by the way, my great aunt who was in Budapest when I was born. My mother wanted to name me Xenia, Xenia, and it was fine there. Coming to the U.S. with that name at that time would have been a nightmare. I was always, when I started a new class, new semester, and then the teacher would go down the roll and read the names, and she'd say, Alma Kadragic. I can't hear you, dear. Kadragic. So, if I had a hard name to pronounce, I mean, I would have never been there to begin with.
If you knew you could not fail, what would you attempt? If you knew you could not fail, what would you attempt?
Oh, I think now what I'm interested in and haven't really done is to invest in some startup companies, things like that. I mean, I'm fascinated by that, and I always advise people, to not wait as long as I did before starting a company, but to do it rather, do it while you're in college. Do it as soon as you leave college. Don't worry about, paying huge, ridiculous amounts of money to be, in some campus somewhere where you're getting drunk and not learning very much, really. I don't like that whole idea of that thing. I know that there are companies these days who will hire bright young bunnies and then send them to school if they like them, if they want to, train them so that they give them the college degree that they need in certain areas, and if they want to start a company and then go to college later, I think that's perfectly fine. I did, when I was in the Orlando period, I did some teaching for the University of Phoenix, and some of that was in school, and other of it was hybrid, kind of online and in school. And what was true of both of the versions was that the students, by and large, were older. So they were there because they wanted to be. They had already done various things. I had one case where there was a young student and her mother who were both students in the same class, and another one where it was an older guy, and he said, well, he's put his kids through college, so now he thinks he should put himself through college as well. Those guys are horribly motivated. They were, they wanted to be there. They took full advantage of it. And I don't think any young person who's sort of, okay, I'll go to college and I'll have a good time, and what am I going to study? Well, we'll see. What's my friend going to do? Those people shouldn't be going to college at that point. They should be doing other things. Traveling around the country is fine too. Traveling overseas. I mean, all of this is now a little bit on hold, but in general, just expanding their horizons, and especially for most Americans, the ones who don't come from immigrant backgrounds like you and I do. Being in another country, doesn't matter which one, or in several other countries, is just tremendous, because we tend to think that everybody is just like us, and nothing could be further from the truth. And also, it gives you become a much more faithful American when you see other places, because we have our problems, as we know, but they're nothing compared to most other countries' problems.
Absolutely. We are absolutely blessed to be here in the United States. So what are the top 3 things you love about living in Florida?
Okay. So I spent, I guess, I don't know, at least 40 years living in cold places. I list New York among that, of course. And then Eastern Europe is even worse, because New York is pretty high on latitude. So even January, when you can have 10, 15 degrees, but you can also have a brilliant sun. So that's great. But if you're in Central and Eastern Europe, on the higher latitudes, as is the case with Warsaw and most of those cities around there, you from November, even the end of October, you just have gray. It's not incredibly cold, but it's bone chilling. It's humid cold, and you very seldom see the sun until March, when it kind of decides to show up again, and everybody's very happy then. So I love not being cold. I love not being cold. I'm always the first person to be cold. When again in Poland, we did a lot of waiting with the crew outside of buildings, waiting for someone to come out or come in, or whatever the typical stuff that TV journalists have to do. And my guys, the crews were all guys. They'd be dressed in short leather jackets and jeans and sneakers, and I would have my fuzzy boots on and gloves, of course, and a couple of sweaters and a heavier jacket and all the rest of it, and I would still be sort of feeling cold. So I love not being cold. And people who are down here who have lived up north, they say, oh, I miss the seasons. I don't miss the seasons at all. They're very nice. I saw a lot of them. I can see them again anytime, but I don't miss them. So that's one thing. I like the short distance from my house. I mean, I'm in Coral Gables. I'm not on the beach or a canal, which you can be here, but I'm not very far from it either. And so I go out. I live on the 5th floor of a 12-story condo, and I take the elevator down, and I mean, either get my car or just go down outside, and I'm in a kind of, it's urban in that there's sidewalks and businesses and so on, but 12 stories, actually you can get a dispensation for having 16 stories, but that's how tall it gets here, and there are not that many of those. So I like while I like the New York skyline and the Brickell skyline, which we have now here too, I like living not in a skyline and going out on my balcony, which faces due east, so I get the nice morning sun. And then by 11 o'clock, the sun is over the building, and that balcony is perfectly shaded and is great. And the third thing is, I guess, the number of restaurants, because there are an awful lot of them. And I always, I mean, in New York, Poland, wherever I was, I always looked for the possibility of eating outdoors. And there's more of that, of course, here. And naturally now, with the situation, we're all looking for these things. So those are three things I really enjoy.
Well, thank you for joining us today. It was an absolute pleasure.
Thank you. It was great.
So please be sure to subscribe to our podcast on all your favorite podcasting listening platforms. Follow us on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and Twitter. Visit our website to see some extras regarding this episode. Our website is thefloridaville.com. Our audio editor for this podcast episode is Joy Tootle with Rocket Ship Consultants. If you're interested in starting a live stream or podcast, contact Joy at rocketshipconsultants.com. Thank you for tuning in.